There is something operating inside you right now that you didn't choose to activate. It was running before you woke up this morning. It was running during every conversation you had this week, where you said one thing and meant another. It was running the last time you set a goal you didn't reach, and the last time something good happened that you immediately found a reason to distrust. It has no off switch. And here is what makes this strange. Most people who are deeply interested in manifestation, who have read the books, sat with the ideas, tried the visualizations, are using this same mechanism against themselves every single day. Not because they lack discipline, not because they don't believe hard enough, but because they never learned that manifestation isn't something you do in a session. It's something you are doing constantly, across multiple layers of your existence, most of which you have never been formally introduced to. That is the paradox this video is going to sit with. Not solve immediately. Sit with. Because if you move too fast past a paradox, you solve the wrong problem and feel very good about it for about 3 weeks. So here it is stated plainly. If manifestation is a real process, and there is significant philosophical, neurological, and even physical evidence that it is, in ways that have nothing to do with magical thinking, then why does the average person who actively tries to manifest spend years working at it and still feel like they are pushing a door that opens from the other side? The standard answer is that they aren't believing hard enough, or that they have subconscious resistance, or that the universe has a different timeline. These answers are not wrong exactly, but they are incomplete in a way that makes them functionally useless, because they all point to the same level of the human system, treat that level as the whole story, and send you back to work on the same floor you've been working on for years. It isn't the whole story. There are levels to this, actual levels, not metaphorical floors in a self-help building. Real distinguishable domains of human experience, each with its own logic, its own language, and its own relationship to what eventually shows up in your life as circumstance, as pattern, as the specific texture of your days. Most people try to manifest from one of those levels, some from two. Very few have ever been shown that all of them exist simultaneously, that all of them are always active, and that when they are not coherent with each other, when they are quietly pulling in different directions, nothing lands. Not because the process doesn't work, because you are not sending a single signal. You are sending noise that looks from the outside like intention. That one shift in understanding changes the entire conversation. And if you are somewhere in the second half of your life, if you are 45 or 55 or somewhere past 60, this matters to you in a specific way. It simply does not matter to someone at 28. Because you have lived long enough to accumulate evidence. You have watched certain patterns repeat themselves across different jobs, different relationships, different versions of the same goal. You have seen things you wanted arrive, and noticed that arriving didn't feel the way you expected. You have seen things you feared come true, and felt somewhere beneath the surprise that you saw them coming before they came. That is not bad luck. That is not weak faith. That is a system you have never been properly shown the map of. This video is that map. Not a technique, not a morning protocol, not 5 steps to anything. A map, which means its only purpose is to show you where you actually are, so that the movement you are already making starts landing somewhere real. Maps don't tell you what to want. They show you the terrain between here and there. And right now you are standing on terrain you have been navigating without one. Here is what the manifestation conversation almost always gets wrong. It treats the mind as the origin point, as the place where everything starts and therefore the place where everything must be fixed. Change your thoughts, change your reality, reprogram your subconscious, shift your beliefs. The entire architecture of modern manifestation culture is built on this assumption, that the mental layer is the primary layer, and that if you can just get that layer clean and clear and pointed in the right direction, everything else will follow. And there is truth in that partial truth. The kind of partial truth that is more dangerous than a full lie, because it keeps you working on something real while missing something essential. The mind is not the origin point. It is one floor of a building that has several floors, and the mistake, the specific, costly, years-consuming mistake, is trying to renovate the 3rd floor while the foundation is running a completely different program. Let's be precise about what levels actually means here, because this word gets used loosely, and that looseness is part of the problem. When philosophers and contemplatives across very different traditions talk about levels of reality or levels of being, they are not talking about abstract metaphysical poetry. They are pointing at something observable. They are pointing at the fact that a human being is not a single unified thing experiencing life from one vantage point. A human being is a nested system, a set of interlocking domains that are all real, all active, and all participating in what eventually becomes your experienced life as circumstance, as opportunity, as the specific kind of person who shows up in a room. Think of it this way. There is the level of the body, not the physical body as a machine to be optimized, but the body as an information system. The body that holds posture, that holds breath patterns. That carries the specific muscle tension of old grief that you intellectually resolved 15 years ago, but that still lives in your jaw, your chest, your shoulders, when someone mentions a certain kind of failure. The body that responds to a room before your conscious mind has finished processing what the room contains. There is the level of emotion, not feelings as decoration or weather, but emotion as orientation system. Emotion as the mechanism that determines, below the level of deliberate thought, what you are actually moving toward and what you are actually moving away from, regardless of what your stated intentions are on any given morning. There is the level of thought, the one everyone knows, the one everyone works on, the mental layer of belief, narrative, interpretation, and the stories you have been telling about yourself long enough that you stopped noticing they are stories. And then there is a fourth level, one that sits above the other three in a very specific sense, and that the manifestation conversation almost never reaches. The level of being, of identity, of who you fundamentally understand yourself to be before you start thinking about what you want, before you start feeling about whether you deserve it, before your body has a chance to confirm or contradict any of it. 4 levels: body, emotion, mind, being. They are always all running, simultaneously, right now as you watch this. And when they are aligned, when what your body carries, what your emotional system orients toward, what your mind believes, and what your deep sense of identity quietly holds, are all pointing at the same thing. Manifestation is not a practice you engage in. It is a structural inevitability. Things move toward you because every part of the system that is you is configured to receive them. When they are not aligned, and for most people most of the time they are not, you get what most people experience: intellectual clarity about what they want, emotional ambivalence about whether they deserve it or whether it will last, a body that behaves as if the old, smaller story is still true, and an identity that silently organizes everything, every interpretation, every decision, every relationship, to confirm what it has always believed about itself. You can visualize every morning for 3 years, and that system will still win. Not because visualization doesn't work, because you are visualizing on one floor while 3 other floors are running a completely different program. And the floors that are running that other program are older, deeper, and far more practiced than your morning intention ritual. This is not a personal failure. This is a structural misunderstanding. And structural misunderstandings don't respond to effort. They respond to clarity. More effort applied to the wrong level doesn't get you closer. It gets you tired. But here is where this becomes more interesting and more consequential. Identifying the 4 levels is the beginning of something, not the end of it. Because the levels don't just exist in parallel, like separate rooms you can visit one at a time and tidy up independently. They communicate. They influence each other in specific directions, with a specific hierarchy. And understanding that hierarchy is what separates someone who has intellectual knowledge of this framework from someone who actually lives differently because of it. And that hierarchy, where change actually originates, how it moves through the system, and why working from the bottom up almost always fails, is exactly what the next section is about. Here is something that should make you stop. Across cultures that had no contact with each other, across centuries that shared no common intellectual tradition, across disciplines that spoke entirely different languages, philosophers, mystics, scientists, and physicians kept arriving at the same basic map. Not the same words, not the same metaphysics, not the same conclusions about what it all means, but the same structure, the same number of floors. The same observation that what happens at one level is not independent of what happens at the others. That kind of convergence is not coincidence. when completely independent systems of inquiry keep finding the same architecture, the most reasonable conclusion is not that they all made the same poetic mistake. It is that they were all pointing at something real that resists being described from only one angle. Start with Plotinus, the 3rd century philosopher who systematized what we now call Neoplatonism, a tradition of thought that treated reality not as a flat surface of material facts, but as a series of emanating levels proceeding from a single source. His central architectural claim running through his Enneads was that the denser, more concrete levels of reality are downstream from the subtler ones. That the physical world, the world of form, of circumstance, of what you can touch and measure and point to, is an expression of something prior to it, not the other way around. That if you want to change what exists at the level of form, working at the level of form is the least efficient place to start. Plotinus wasn't doing self-help, he was doing rigorous metaphysics. But the architectural principle, that causation in human experience moves from the subtle toward the dense, from the interior toward the exterior, from being toward circumstance, is structurally identical to what we are examining here. Move forward several centuries to the Hermetic tradition, the body of philosophical and mystical thought crystallized in texts like the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of writings that circulated through the ancient Mediterranean world and became foundational to Renaissance thinking about the nature of mind and matter. At the center of this tradition sits the principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without. This principle is quoted constantly in spiritual circles and almost never read carefully. Read it structurally, not as poetry, but as a claim about architecture, and it says something precise, that the levels of reality mirror each other, that there is a genuine correspondence, a structural homology, between what operates at the level of consciousness and what manifests at the level of physical circumstance. The implication is not that positive thinking attracts good parking spots. The implication is that the configuration of your inner system, across all its levels, is not separate from the configuration of what your outer life keeps producing. They are the same pattern, seen from two different vantage points. The Hermetic map distinguishes between the mental plane, the emotional vital plane, and the physical plane. 3 of the 4 levels named in the last section, identified and mapped in a tradition that predates modern psychology by nearly 2,000 years. Then comes Spinoza, the 17th century Dutch philosopher whose ideas were so structurally radical that his own community excommunicated him for them. Spinoza's central claim was that mind and matter are not 2 separate substances in a causal relationship with each other. They are 2 attributes of a single infinite substance, 2 ways of describing the same underlying reality from 2 different perspectives. What you experience as thought and what appears as physical circumstance are not one causing the other. They are parallel expressions of the same process. The practical implication of this is quieter and more demanding than it first appears. It means that trying to use mental force to change physical circumstance, trying to think your way into a different life, is a category error. Not because thought is powerless, because thought is one face of a deeper movement, not the engine of it. When the deeper movement shifts, both faces shift together. When only the surface face is manipulated, the deeper movement continues unchanged and eventually pulls the surface back into its original shape. This is why you can have a genuine insight, feel completely different for 72 hours, and then watch yourself slide back into the exact same patterns you thought you had just escaped. The insight was real, but it landed at the level of mind, while the level of being remained untouched. And being in Spinoza's architecture is closer to the source. It wins. Now move into the 20th century, and into territory that makes some people uncomfortable because it sits at the intersection of established science and questions that science has not fully resolved. But the discomfort is worth staying with because the evidence here is not speculative. It is peer-reviewed, replicated, and quietly transformative, if you let it land. Neurologist Antonio Damasio spent decades studying patients with specific types of brain damage, particularly damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region where emotional processing and rational decision-making converge. What he found dismantled one of the Enlightenment's most cherished assumptions, that reason and emotion are opposing forces, and that the ideal human being is the one who has learned to let reason govern emotion. His patients with damage to this region were, in measurable terms, more purely rational than most people. They could analyze situations with cold clarity. They could list the pros and cons of any decision with perfect logical structure, and they were completely unable to make functional choices, not because they lacked intelligence. Because without emotional signal, without what Damasio called the somatic marker, the body-based felt sense that orients a decision before the reasoning begins, the rational mind had no way to assign weight to any option. Every choice looked equally valid. The cognitive machinery was intact. The deeper orientation system was gone. The implication for manifestation is not subtle. If your emotional level is not oriented toward what your mental level is intending, you are not experiencing a conflict between two equally weighted systems. You are experiencing a situation in which the orientation system is pulling in one direction while the articulation system is pointing in another. And the orientation system, older, faster, more fundamental, will determine where you actually move, regardless of what you articulate. Not sometimes, structurally, every time. Go deeper still into the domain of nervous system science, and you find the work of Stephen Porges and his Polyvagal Theory. The discovery that the autonomic nervous system, the largely unconscious regulatory system governing your physiological state at any given moment, operates in a hierarchy of its own. When that system is in a state of chronic low-grade threat, not panic, not crisis, but the quiet, persistent sense that the world is slightly unsafe, that resources are scarce, that good things require defending, it configures every other system accordingly. Perception narrows, attention contracts. The social engagement system, which is also the system through which opportunity, connection, and genuine creativity flow, goes partially offline. You can intend expansively while your nervous system is configured for contraction. The intention will not win. This is not a spiritual metaphor. This is measurable autonomic physiology, and it maps precisely onto what contemplatives across multiple traditions have been describing for centuries, that the state from which you act determines the quality of what the action produces, independent of the content of the action itself. Now bring all of this together: Plotinus, the Hermeticists, Spinoza, Damasio, Porges, and what you have is not a collection of interesting ideas from different centuries. What you have is a convergence, a set of completely independent investigations, conducted with completely different tools, arriving at a shared structural conclusion that the human being operates across multiple levels, that those levels have a hierarchy, and that durable change in what appears at the outer levels requires something to shift at the inner ones. The ancient traditions called this levels of being. Modern neuroscience calls it hierarchical regulation. The language is different. The building is the same. And here is what makes this more than academically interesting. Here is what makes this the most practically significant thing you might sit with today. Every single one of these traditions, without exception, also mapped the point at which that inner shift becomes possible. They did not just describe the problem, they identified the specific level at which intervention is actually effective. And with remarkable consistency across all of them, that level was not the mental one. It was deeper. It was the level that Plotinus called the soul, not in a religious sense, but as the animating principle that precedes both thought and sensation. The level that the Hermeticists called the causal plane, the domain where pattern originates before it descends into emotion, then into thought, then into physical form. The level that Spinoza gestured toward when he spoke of conatus, the fundamental drive of a thing to persist and express itself according to its own nature. The level that Damasio's research points toward when it locates the source of coherent decision-making, not in the cortex, but in the integrated signal of body, emotion, and identity operating as a single system. In every map, it is the same flaw. The level of being, the level of identity, the level of what you are before you start deciding what you want. Knowing this intellectually is one thing. And this is precisely where the evidence stops being historical and starts being uncomfortably personal, because every person watching this has, at some point, known something true about themselves that they could not seem to act on, has understood clearly and completely what needed to change, and watched themselves not change it, has had the insight without the transformation. That gap between knowing and being is not a willpower problem. It is a levels problem. And closing that gap requires understanding not just that the levels exist, but how they speak to each other, how change moves between them, and why the direction of that movement matters more than the force you apply to it. Let's stop moving through history for a moment. Let's move into your life instead, specifically into the part of your life that you have probably spent the most time trying to understand and the least time actually reading correctly. If you are in your mid-40s or beyond, you have something that no amount of theory can manufacture, a longitudinal record. You have decades of data, decades of choices made and outcomes received, of intentions set and patterns that either shifted or quietly reasserted themselves despite everything you tried. You have, in other words, direct empirical evidence of exactly how your system operates across all four levels: body, emotion, mind, and being, whether you have ever framed it that way or not. The question is not whether the evidence exists. It does, in abundance. The question is whether you have been reading it in a language that lets you actually use it. Most people read their personal history as a story about external circumstances, about the economy, about other people's choices, about timing that was or wasn't on their side. Some read it as a story about their own failures of discipline or belief. Both of those readings contain partial truth, but neither of them is reading the data at the level where the data is most informative. Here is a more useful reading. Think about a pattern in your life that has repeated itself across genuinely different contexts, different jobs or different relationships, or different attempts at the same goal in different decades. A pattern specific enough that when you encounter it, some part of you recognizes it before your conscious mind has fully processed what is happening. That flicker of recognition, that almost familiar feeling of here we are again. That pattern is not bad luck. It is not the universe testing you. It is not evidence that you are fundamentally broken or uniquely cursed. It is your system operating coherently across all four levels, just not in the direction you consciously prefer. At the level of body, a set of physiological habits, breath patterns, postural defaults, and nervous system configurations that were calibrated, probably in the first 2 decades of your life, to navigate a specific kind of environment. Those configurations became your baseline, and your baseline shapes what you perceive, what you reach toward, and what you unconsciously signal to everyone around you, long after the original environment that required them has ceased to exist. At the level of emotion, an orientation system that learned, through repetition and consequence, what kinds of outcomes are available to someone like you, not what you were told was available, what you experienced as available in the body, in real time, across real situations. And that experiential learning sits beneath your stated beliefs like bedrock beneath soil. You can plant new beliefs in the soil every season. The bedrock doesn't move. At the level of mind, a narrative about who you are and what your life means that was assembled, largely without your conscious participation, from the interpretations you made of early experiences, the conclusions you drew from the patterns that repeated, and the stories your environment handed you before you were old enough to evaluate them. That narrative is not your truth, but it functions as your truth, because every new piece of information you receive gets filtered through it before you consciously process it. And at the level of being, an identity, a felt sense of what kind of person you fundamentally are, not what you aspire to be, not what you perform in your best moments, but what you return to when no one is watching and nothing is at stake. The self that exists before the effort begins. Now here is the thing about being 45 or 55 or 65 that changes everything about how this works. At 25, the system is still relatively plastic. The patterns are established but not yet deeply grooved. The identity is still somewhat negotiable, not because young people are more open necessarily, but because they haven't yet had enough repetitions for the grooves to become load-bearing walls. By the time you reach midlife, the grooves are structural. The patterns have been confirmed by enough experience, enough repetition, enough survival that the system treats them not as habits, but as facts, not as tendencies, but as truths about reality itself. This sounds like bad news. It isn't. It is actually a profound advantage, if you know how to use it. Because what structural depth also means is that when a shift happens at the level of being in a person who has lived long enough, it doesn't look like a new idea. It looks like a recognition, like something that was always true finally becoming visible. And that kind of shift, the recognition rather than the acquisition, is faster, deeper, and far more durable than anything that happens through disciplined effort applied at the level of mind. You are not starting over. You are reading a map of somewhere you have already been living. And when you look at your personal history through this lens, body, emotion, mind, being, certain things that previously seemed mysterious become almost obvious. The relationship that kept recreating the same dynamic with different people wasn't about those people. It was about what your emotional orientation system recognized as familiar and therefore safe, regardless of whether it was good. The career that kept plateauing at a certain level wasn't about your skills or your effort. It was about the ceiling your identity had quietly installed, the point at which more visibility, more success, or more responsibility began to feel like a threat rather than an extension of who you are. The business idea you kept almost launching, the conversation you kept almost having, the version of yourself you kept almost becoming. Almost is not a discipline problem. Almost is a levels problem. Almost is what happens when one or two levels are moving forward while the others are holding their position, waiting for something they recognize as safe enough to follow. What would it mean to read your history not as evidence of what you are capable of, but as a precise record of where your levels have been coherent and where they have been in quiet conflict? Because if you can read it that way, if you can look at the last 20 or 30 years and identify not just what happened, but which level was running the show at each critical juncture, then you have something far more valuable than a new technique. You have a diagnosis, and a diagnosis in the right hands is the beginning of something that effort alone never produces: targeted movement. Movement applied at the level where it can actually propagate through the system, rather than movement applied at the surface while the deeper levels watch and wait. You already have the evidence, you have been carrying it for decades. The map was missing, not the data. So now we arrive at the part of this conversation that most treatments of manifestation either skip entirely or gesture at so briefly that it dissolves before it can do anything useful. The level of being, not as a concept, not as a category in a framework, but as the actual lived territory where manifestation either roots itself permanently or collapses quietly after a few weeks of apparent progress. Let's be precise about what being means here, because the word carries so much philosophical baggage that it can become meaningless through overuse. Being, in the sense that matters practically, is not a state you achieve through meditation. It is not a feeling of peace or expansiveness. It is not the absence of thought. Being, as a level of the human system, is the answer to a question you are always already answering, whether you are conscious of it or not. The question is, who is doing this? Not what do I want, not what do I believe, not even what do I feel, but who is the one who wants, believes, and feels? What is the identity that is prior to all of those processes, the one that they all orbit around, the one that quietly determines which desires get pursued and which get abandoned, which beliefs feel like truth and which feel like performance, which emotional states feel like home and which feel like trespassing? That prior identity is your level of being, and here is what makes it the most consequential level for manifestation. It is the only level that does not respond to instruction. You can instruct the mind, you can direct thought, install new beliefs, practice new narratives. With enough repetition, the mind will carry a new story. You can work with the emotional level, through somatic practice, through therapeutic process, through the slow, unglamorous work of sitting with feelings long enough that they complete their movement rather than getting frozen midway. You can reconfigure the body level through breathwork, through movement, through the deliberate cultivation of new physiological baselines. All of that is real work. All of it matters. But the level of being does not respond to any of it directly. It responds to one thing only: recognition. Not effort, recognition. This is the insight that every tradition we examined in the earlier section was pointing toward, and that almost none of the modern manifestation conversation has successfully translated into practical terms. The Neoplatonists called it anamnesis, literally unforgetting. The idea that the soul does not learn its deepest truths, it remembers them. That the movement toward one's own nature is not acquisition, but recovery. The Hermeticists described initiation not as the installation of new knowledge, but as the removal of what was obscuring knowledge that was already present. Spinoza's concept of adequate ideas, ideas that are fully understood from their own internal logic, rather than received from external authority, points in the same direction, that genuine knowing is not the accumulation of information, but the achievement of a certain kind of internal coherence. Modern psychology arrived at the same territory through a completely different door. Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, spent decades studying what actually produced durable change in the people he worked with. His conclusion was disarmingly simple and almost universally ignored in the practices that followed him. The most powerful agent of change is not the acquisition of new insight. It is unconditional positive regard, the experience of being fully seen and fully accepted as you currently are, without the implicit demand that you become something different before you are worthy of that seeing. Why does that produce change? Because the level of being and the identity level is organized in most people around a fundamental split, around the gap between who they actually are and who they believe they need to become in order to be acceptable, successful, loved, safe. That gap is not motivating, it is contracting. It creates a self that is perpetually at war with itself, perpetually spending energy managing the distance between the real and the required, perpetually unable to move from a place of genuine wholeness, because wholeness keeps getting deferred to a future moment when enough conditions have been met. Manifestation from that place is exhausting, not because you aren't working hard enough, because you are working from a divided source. And a divided source produces, with great consistency, divided results. Things that arrive partially, things that arrive and then somehow fall apart, things that arrive but bring with them a new problem that suspiciously resembles the old one in a different costume. This is the pattern that baffles people most, not the absence of results, the results that arrive and then seem to unravel. The relationship that begins exactly the way you visualized and then migrates over months into the same dynamic you were trying to leave. The financial breakthrough that solves one problem and somehow generates another. The opportunity that opens exactly as intended and then quietly closes before you walk all the way through it. That is not the universe withdrawing its cooperation. That is your level of being reasserting its coherence. Because being is not cruel. It is not sabotaging you. It is doing exactly what any coherent system does when something enters it that doesn't match its fundamental configuration. It metabolizes the foreign element back into the familiar shape, not out of resistance to growth, out of fidelity to its own internal logic. Manifestation is not attraction, it is coherence. Read that again, slowly, because the difference between those two words contains years of wasted effort for most people. Attraction implies that you are here, and the thing you want is there, and that the right mental or emotional state creates a force that pulls it toward you across the distance. It is a fundamentally dualistic model. You and the thing are separate. The practice is about closing the gap. Coherence implies something structurally different. It implies that what appears in your life is not arriving from somewhere else. It is being generated by the configuration of your system across all 4 levels simultaneously. The body that carries a specific history, the emotional system that orients toward specific kinds of experience, the mind that interprets incoming information through a specific narrative, and the identity that holds a specific answer to the question of who is doing all of this. When those 4 levels are coherent, when they are all expressing the same fundamental orientation, not because you have forced them into alignment through technique, but because your level of being has genuinely shifted and the other levels have reorganized themselves around that shift, what you would call manifestation becomes almost structurally inevitable, not magical, mechanical in the deepest sense of that word. The person whose being is genuinely configured around abundance does not attract abundance. They generate it through the specific way they perceive opportunity, through the specific quality of presence they bring to relationships, through the decisions they make automatically, below the level of deliberation because their baseline assumption about what is available is simply different from someone whose being is configured around scarcity. The person whose being is genuinely configured around love does not attract loving relationships. They recognize them, and more crucially, they recognize when something is not that, early enough to make a different choice, rather than investing years in trying to transform something into what it was never going to become. This is the shift, not from negative thinking to positive thinking, not from limiting beliefs to empowering beliefs, from a divided self, one that is perpetually managing the gap between what it is and what it thinks it needs to become, to an integrated one, a self in which the level of being is not a project to be completed, but a ground to be inhabited. And here is where the question of how becomes unavoidable, because recognition, as we established, is the mechanism. But recognition of what exactly? And how does a person who has spent decades organized around a particular identity create the conditions for genuine recognition rather than just another round of intellectual understanding that lands at the level of mind and goes no further? The answer is not a technique, but it has a shape. It begins with honest inventory, not the kind of inventory that catalogs your limiting beliefs so you can replace them with better ones, but the kind that maps where your 4 levels are actually pointed right now, regardless of where you intend them to be pointed. What does your body do when you imagine having what you say you want? Does it relax or does it brace? What does your emotional system do? Does it open or does it contract around a familiar anxiety that you have learned to ignore because it seems irrational given your conscious intentions? What story does your mind tell about what you deserve, about what people like you typically achieve, about whether this particular good thing will last? And at the level of being, who do you return to when the visualization session is over and the ordinary morning resumes? That inventory is not comfortable, but it is the most honest conversation you can have with your own system, and it is the beginning of the only kind of change that actually propagates across all 4 levels, rather than stopping at one. Because once you can see clearly where your levels are actually pointed, you are no longer working blindly. You are no longer applying effort at the surface and hoping it penetrates to the depth. You are working with the grain of the system rather than against it, and working with the grain of a system that has 4 levels of coherent depth is not harder than working against it at 1. It is incomparably easier, not because the work disappears, but because the work starts landing somewhere real instead of dissipating at the surface. Because effort applied at the right level, the level of being through the mechanism of recognition rather than instruction, creates a cascade. The being shifts, even slightly, even partially. And when being shifts, identity shifts. And when identity shifts, the emotional system reorganizes around a new orientation almost automatically, not because you forced it to feel differently, but because it is now receiving a different signal from the level above it. And when the emotional system reorganizes, the body follows. The breath changes, the posture changes. The autonomic baseline shifts from contraction towards something more open. And when all of that is moving in the same direction, the mind, the level everyone starts with, suddenly finds that the new beliefs it has been trying to install for years require almost no effort to maintain, because they are no longer fighting the current. They are the current. This is what genuine manifestation feels like from the inside. Not effortful, not disciplined, inevitable, like a river that has finally found its true channel after spending years carving through resistant rock. But, and this limitation is important enough to name carefully, coherence is not a destination you arrive at and then inhabit permanently. It is not an enlightenment event after which everything becomes effortless forever. It is a practice of recognition, a practice of returning again and again to the honest inventory, of noticing when the levels have drifted out of alignment, because they will drift under pressure, under stress, under the accumulated weight of ordinary life, and of choosing to realign not through force, but through the same quality of honest seeing that produced the original shift. The difference between someone who has understood this and someone who has not is not that the first person never experiences misalignment. It is that they can read it when it happens. They have the map. And having the map means that drift is not failure. It is information. Let's slow down here. Not because we are almost done, though we are, but because this specific moment in a video like this one is where the most important thing either lands or it doesn't. And whether it lands has nothing to do with the ideas. The ideas have been laid out. They are either resonating or they aren't. What determines whether they become anything more than interesting is something quieter than ideas. So let me speak directly to you, not to the general audience of people who might watch this, to you, the specific person who is still here, 9 or 10 minutes in, which means you did not come for entertainment and you did not stay for comfort. You stayed because something in this conversation is touching something you already knew, not learned just now, already knew. Something you have felt at the edges of your understanding for years, possibly decades, without having the precise language to name it. The sense that the problem was never motivation, the sense that you were not, at your core, broken or incapable, or fundamentally less than what you were trying to become. The sense that something structural was off, that you were, in some way you couldn't fully articulate, working against yourself at a level deeper than the one you had access to. That sense was accurate. It was not self-pity, it was not an excuse. It was your system trying to show you something true about its own architecture that you did not yet have the vocabulary to receive. You have that vocabulary now. And here is what I want you to sit with. Not as an assignment, not as the next thing to add to the list of things you are working on, but as a genuine question that deserves genuine attention. Where specifically have you been applying effort at the wrong level? Not in general, specifically. What is the thing, the goal, the relationship, the version of yourself that you have been working toward with consistent mental intention and inconsistent results? And when you bring that thing to mind right now, not as an idea, but as a felt sense in the body, what happens? Does something open or does something brace? That response, the one that happened before you had a chance to think about it, is your system giving you an honest answer about where its levels actually are. Not where you want them to be, not where they are in your morning journaling practice, where they are right now in real time when the thing you say you want is genuinely present to you. That is the inventory, not a worksheet, not a therapeutic excavation you have to schedule and prepare for. A single moment of honest attention to what is actually happening across all 4 levels simultaneously when what you want is genuinely in the room with you rather than safely abstract in a visualization. Most people never do this. Not because they are avoidant or undisciplined, because nobody told them this was the question to ask, because the entire conversation they had been handed told them to focus on the vision, to hold the feeling of having it, to act as if, and all of those instructions, well-intentioned as they are, operate at the level of mind and emotion while leaving the level of being completely unaddressed. You are not most people. Not because you are exceptional in some flattering way I am saying to keep you watching, because you are someone who has lived long enough and paid enough attention to your own life to know the difference between an idea that sounds good and a thing that is actually true. And the thing that is actually true, the thing this entire conversation has been building toward, is this. You are not trying to become someone who manifests. You already are someone who manifests. You have been doing it continuously, coherently, and with remarkable consistency for decades. The question was never whether the process works. The question was whether you were conscious enough of all 4 levels of the process to direct it deliberately, rather than having it run on the defaults installed before you were old enough to choose them. Consciousness of the levels is not the same as control of the levels, but it is the beginning of something that control alone never produces: genuine agency. The capacity to participate knowingly in a process that was always already happening, and to participate from the level deep enough that your participation actually changes the output. That is not a small thing. That is arguably the only thing that matters in this entire domain. And the question it leaves open, the one that the next section is going to close, is what it actually means to live from that place. Not as a concept, not as an aspiration, as the ordinary, daily, unsexy practice of a person who has understood what level the work actually happens on. We started with a paradox, something operating inside you that you didn't choose to activate. A mechanism running continuously across every layer of your experience, producing results with perfect consistency, results that often had nothing to do with what you consciously intended, and everything to do with what you were configured to generate at levels you had never been formally introduced to. That paradox has a resolution now, not a tidy one. Resolutions that are too tidy are almost always wrong, but a real one. One that holds up under scrutiny and under the weight of actual lived experience. Here it is, stated as plainly as language allows. Manifestation is not a practice you do. It is a process you are. It operates across 4 levels simultaneously: body, emotion, mind, and being. And its output is determined not by the level you focus on most consciously, but by the degree of coherence between all 4. When those levels are aligned, not through force, not through technique, but through the genuine shift that happens when the level of being recognizes something true about itself, the other levels reorganize around that recognition, and what reorganizes at the level of being propagates downward through emotion, through thought, through the body, and eventually into the texture of your external life, not as a magical event, but as a structural inevitability. You do not attract what you want. You generate what you are coherent with. That sentence is the synthesis of everything covered in this conversation, from Plotinus to Damasio, from the Hermetic principle of correspondence to the polyvagal nervous system, from the philosophical concept of conatus to the clinical findings of Carl Rogers. Every one of those traditions and disciplines, approached from its own angle with its own tools, arrived at a version of the same structural truth, that the human being is a multi-level system, that the levels communicate in a specific direction, and that durable change in what appears at the outer levels requires something to shift at the innermost one, the level of being, not the level of wanting, not the level of believing, not even the level of feeling, as important as feeling is. The level of identity, of who you are before the wanting, the believing, and the feeling begin. And here is the part of the synthesis that closes the loop opened at the very beginning of this conversation, the part about why the machine was running against you even while you were actively trying to direct it. It wasn't running against you. It was running for you, for the version of you that your level of being had established as its baseline, for the self that was assembled from early experience, confirmed by repeated patterns, and gradually solidified into something that felt less like a habit and more like a fact about reality. That self was being served with remarkable efficiency. Every pattern that repeated, every ceiling that reasserted itself, almost all of it, was the system delivering exactly what it was coherently configured to deliver. The problem was never the machine. The problem was that nobody showed you the controls were at a different level than the one you had been working on. Now you have seen them, and seeing them, genuinely seeing them, not just understanding them intellectually, but feeling the specific difference between the level of mind, where you have been applying most of your effort, and the level of being where the configuration actually lives. That seeing is not preparation for the work. That seeing is the work. Because the level of being, as we established, does not respond to instruction. It responds to recognition. And recognition, by definition, cannot be scheduled or forced. It can only be prepared for by clearing enough of the noise at the other levels that the signal from the deepest one becomes audible. You have been trying to change the signal. The invitation now is to become quiet enough to hear what it is already saying. What it is saying in most people who have lived long and paid attention is not as far from what they want as they feared. The distance between who you currently are at the level of being and who you would need to be to generate what you most genuinely want is, in almost every case, smaller than the years of struggle would suggest. Because the struggle was not evidence of distance. It was evidence of misdirection, of effort applied at the wrong level, with great sincerity, for a long time. Sincere misdirection is still misdirection, but misdirection that becomes visible is no longer misdirection. It is a corrected course. And a corrected course, even late, even after decades of moving in a slightly wrong direction, compounds in the right direction with the same relentless consistency that the misdirection did. The map is not the territory, but without the map, you are navigating territory that is always larger and more complex than you can hold in your head at once. With the map, with the genuine understanding that you are a 4-level system, that coherence between those levels is the actual mechanism, and that the level of being is both the most important and the most accessible once you stop trying to reach it by force, The territory becomes navigable in a way it simply was not before. Not easy, navigable. There is a difference, and that difference is everything. You are not starting over. You are, for possibly the first time, starting correctly. If something in this conversation landed, not just as an interesting idea, but as a recognition, the specific kind of recognition we spent the last several minutes describing, then the most useful thing you can do right now is not to immediately go looking for the next piece of content that continues the thought. Sit with this one first. Not because there isn't more to explore. There is, and we will go there in future videos, into the specific practices that create the conditions for recognition at the level of being, into what the body level reveals that the mind cannot access on its own, into the question of how coherence actually feels different from the inside compared to the effortful alignment you have been practicing. But those conversations will mean more, will land at a deeper level, will be received by a system that is more ready to use them, if you arrive at them having genuinely metabolized this one first. So if you are willing, before you close this, before you move to the next thing in the queue, take 60 seconds, not to visualize, not to set an intention, just to ask the inventory question honestly, in the body, not in the mind. What is the thing you most want to generate in this next chapter of your life? And when you bring it genuinely present, not as an idea, but as a felt reality, what do all four levels do? What does the body do? What does the emotional system do? What does the mind say beneath the optimistic narrative? And at the level of being, who shows up? That answer is your starting point. Not a problem to fix immediately, a place to begin seeing from. If this conversation gave you something real, the most meaningful thing you can do is share it with someone who is ready for it, not to spread an idea, but because the people in your life who are asking the same questions deserve access to a framework that might save them years of sincere, misdirected effort. And if you want to continue this conversation, if you want to go deeper into any one of the four levels or into the specific question of how recognition at the level of being actually happens in practice rather than in theory, leave that in the comments. Not as engagement for its own sake, because the direction this channel goes is genuinely shaped by what you are actually sitting with. The work is yours. The map is here. You were never missing the ability. You were missing the address.